The WhatsApp group chat had been buzzing for months. Class of 2003 reunion planning, venue bookings, catering discussions, photo booth arrangements. 312 messages I watched scroll by without a single mention of my name. Not even when Sarah Martinez asked if anyone had contact info for, quote, missing classmates. 20 years later, and I was still invisible to them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Then came the moment that changed everything. As their reunion reached its peak at the Riverside Country Club, the perfectly manicured lawn suddenly erupted in chaos. The DJ's music cut out. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. 200 former classmates shielded their eyes and ducked as my Navy helicopter descended from the October sky, rotors thundering like divine intervention. Through the aircraft's open door, I could see their faces pressed against the windows, the same faces that had looked right through me in the hallways of Lincoln High. My aide stepped out first, then offered me his hand as I emerged in full dress whites, 4 stars gleaming on my collar. The helicopter lifted away, leaving only the echo of its departure, and 2 words that cut through the stunned silence like a blade through silk. Admiral Chen has arrived. My name is David Chen, and at 17 I believed high school would be my launching pad to greatness. Instead, it became a masterclass in systematic erasure. Lincoln High School in suburban Phoenix was supposed to be where dreams took flight. But for kids like me, quiet, focused, and decidedly uncool, it was where ambitions went to suffocate under the weight of social hierarchies. I wasn't unpopular exactly, I was worse. I was forgettable. The kind of student teachers, remembered only when taking attendance, whose yearbook photo you'd flip past without a second glance. While Brett Davidson threw legendary parties at his parents' desert mansion and Melissa Torres reigned as homecoming queen 3 years running, I spent Friday nights in the school library, teaching myself advanced calculus and reading naval history books that transported me to battles fought centuries before I was born. My parents, immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had, couldn't understand why I didn't fit in. Every dinner conversation felt like an interrogation. David, why don't you join the basketball team? You're tall enough. David, have you made any friends yet? Mrs. Patterson's son has so many friends. They meant well, but their concern only amplified the echo chamber of my isolation. The pattern established itself early freshman year. I'd raise my hand in AP history with insights that made our teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, nod approvingly, only to have my contributions met with eye rolls from classmates who saw academic enthusiasm as social suicide. During group projects, I'd be picked last, relegated to doing all the research while others took credit for presentations. When leadership positions opened up, I'd be overlooked despite having the highest grades and most innovative ideas. The student council elections junior year crystallized everything wrong with my high school experience. I ran for president with a comprehensive platform addressing real issues, outdated textbooks, insufficient college preparation resources, and the need for peer tutoring programs. My opponent, Chad Morrison, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in Phoenix, ran on a platform of more fun activities and better food. His campaign consisted of professionally printed posters and a promotional video his father's marketing company produced. Mine consisted of handwritten flyers I'd made at Kinko's with my part-time job money. During the candidate speeches, I delivered what I thought was a compelling argument for substantive change. I presented statistics about our school's declining college acceptance rates compared to neighboring districts. I outlined detailed proposals for improving our science labs and expanding the computer programming courses. I spoke with passion about creating mentorship programs that would help students like me, academically driven but socially invisible, find their place in the ecosystem. The applause was polite but hollow. Chad followed with jokes, promises of pizza parties, and a pledge to get the soda machines restocked with better flavors. The auditorium erupted. Students cheered, whistled, and chanted his name. When the votes were counted, Chad won by a landslide. It wasn't even close. That night, I sat in my bedroom staring at the rejection letter that had arrived the same day from my dream college's early admission program. Double defeat in a single afternoon. My mother knocked on the door with green tea and fortune cookies from the restaurant where she worked 60-hour weeks to pay for my SAT prep courses. "Sometimes, David," she said in her broken English, "the world is not ready for what you have to give. But that doesn't mean you stop giving." Her words would prove prophetic, though it would take 2 decades for their full meaning to reveal itself. The exclusion wasn't always dramatic. It was the 1,000 small cuts that carved away my confidence piece by piece. Being the only student not invited to study groups before major exams, despite having the highest test scores in the class. Watching classmates organize weekend adventures through group chats I was never added to. Sitting alone at lunch tables while conversations swirled around me as if I existed in a parallel dimension. Senior year brought the National Merit Scholar announcement. My name appeared on the list posted outside the principal's office, but somehow, the recognition assembly failed to include me. They called up 12 students, including 3 whose scores I knew were significantly lower than mine, but never called my name. I sat in the back of the auditorium, watching my academic achievements vanish into administrative oversight or deliberate omission. I never found out which. The yearbook signing tradition in the final weeks felt like a ritual designed to highlight exactly where I stood in the social order. Popular students had lines of people waiting to write messages in their books. Star athletes collected signatures like autographs. Even average students had friends scribbling inside jokes and summer plans across their pages. My yearbook collected dust on my desk until the last day, when I finally asked 3 classmates to sign it. Their messages were identical variations of "good luck in college," written with the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling a charitable obligation. Graduation day arrived with all the pomp and circumstance my parents had dreamed of since immigrating to America. They sat in the 3rd row, my father in his only suit, my mother clutching the camera she'd saved up for months to buy. When they called my name for summa cum laude honors, their pride echoed across the gymnasium louder than any applause from my classmates. I walked across that stage knowing it was an ending, not just of high school, but of trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for someone like me. The morning after graduation, while my classmates nursed hangovers from parties I wasn't invited to, I was already researching Naval Academy preparation programs. The rejection from my first-choice college had redirected my path towards something I hadn't initially considered: military service. What started as a backup plan began to feel like destiny calling. My parents didn't understand. "David, you have full scholarship to State University. Why you want to be soldier?" But something deeper than career planning was driving my decision. The Navy represented everything high school hadn't: merit-based advancement, clear chains of command, and success measured by competence rather than popularity. In military service, your worth wasn't determined by who liked you at lunch tables, but by how well you executed your mission when lives depended on your decisions. The Naval Academy preparatory program became my bridge between the world that had overlooked me and the one that would finally see my potential. For 18 months, I immersed myself in mathematics, physics, leadership studies, and physical conditioning. I learned that real strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the most prepared when the room fell silent and everyone looked to you for answers. My acceptance letter to the United States Naval Academy arrived on a Tuesday morning in February. I remember the weight of the envelope, heavier than I'd expected, as if it contained more than paper and ink. My mother cried reading it, not from sadness but from recognition that her son was finally heading somewhere that would appreciate what she had always seen in him. That night, I pulled out my high school yearbook for the first time since graduation. I flipped through pages of faces that had looked through me for 4 years, reading inscriptions about futures that seemed so certain then. I wondered how many of those confident predictions would prove accurate, how many dreams would survive contact with reality, and whether any of my former classmates would remember the quiet kid who sat in the back corner calculating trajectories while they planned weekend parties. I closed the yearbook and placed it in a box with other artifacts from my Phoenix childhood. The next chapter of my life would be written at sea, in command centers, and in situations where being overlooked wasn't an option, because failure meant consequences measured in lives rather than lunch table seating arrangements. High school had taught me what it felt like to be invisible. The Navy would teach me how to command the horizon. The Naval Academy transformed me from invisible to indispensable. 4 years in Annapolis stripped away every insecurity Phoenix had carved into my bones and replaced them with precision, purpose, and an unshakable confidence in my own capabilities. My classmates there didn't care that I'd been ignored at Lincoln High. They cared that I could navigate by stars, calculate missile trajectories under pressure, and lead tactical exercises that saved hypothetical lives in wargame scenarios. By my junior year, I was battalion commander. By senior year, I was receiving recruitment calls from submarine commands and surface warfare divisions across the fleet. My thesis on next-generation naval defense systems caught the attention of Pentagon strategists, who invited me to present at classified briefings before I'd even graduated. The quiet kid from suburban Phoenix had found his voice in the language of leadership and tactical excellence. My first deployment aboard the USS Leviathan changed everything I thought I knew about my own potential. As a junior officer responsible for weapons systems coordination, I identified a critical vulnerability in our defensive grid that could have left us exposed during a hostile encounter in the South China Sea. My commanding officer, Captain Morrison, no relation to the Chad Morrison from high school, thank God, didn't just listen to my assessment. He implemented my recommendations and credited my foresight in his official report to Naval Command. That report launched my career into hyperdrive. Promotion to lieutenant came ahead of schedule. Assignment to the prestigious Naval War College followed. My research on asymmetric warfare strategies earned publication in the Naval Institute proceedings, the kind of recognition that typically took officers decades to achieve. By 30, I was commanding my own vessel. By 35, I was the youngest captain in Pacific Fleet operations. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my former classmates were updating LinkedIn profiles and attending networking happy hours in Phoenix, I was briefing Joint Chiefs of Staff on maritime security threats and coordinating international naval exercises with allied forces. The skills that made me invisible in high school, analytical thinking, strategic planning, quiet intensity, had become the foundation of a military career that was redefining what leadership looked like in modern naval operations. But success, I learned, creates its own gravitational field that pulls unexpected objects into your orbit. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing deployment schedules for the Pacific 7th Fleet. The sender was someone I hadn't thought about in 15 years. Jessica Liu, who had been student body treasurer at Lincoln High and was now, according to her professional signature, a senior acquisition specialist at Raytheon Defense Systems. The subject line read, "Reconnection and Opportunity." Her message was warm, professional, and completely out of character for someone who had never spoken to me during 4 years of shared classes. She explained that she'd been following my career through military trade publications and was impressed by my innovations in naval defense technology. Raytheon was developing next-generation systems that aligned perfectly with my expertise, and she wondered if I might be interested in consulting opportunities that could supplement my military service. The timing seemed serendipitous. I was between major deployments, had accumulated significant leave time, and the consulting work she described would allow me to apply my knowledge in ways that could benefit both private sector innovation and military preparedness. We arranged a video call where Jessica, now polished and confident in ways that would have intimidated my teenage self, outlined a project that seemed tailor-made for my background. What I didn't realize was that Jessica Liu was no longer the insecure treasurer who had counted dance tickets and managed bake sale revenues. She had become something far more dangerous. A former classmate with access to defense contracts, government connections, and a 20-year memory of exactly how invisible I used to be. The consulting arrangements started innocuously enough. Monthly video conferences, discussing theoretical applications of my research. Technical reviews of proposed systems that leveraged insights from my published work. Compensation that was generous but not excessive, structured to avoid any conflicts of interest with my military obligations. Jessica presented everything with the kind of professional competence that made me forget we'd once shared hallways where she'd looked right through me. 6 months into our collaboration, the first irregularity appeared. A classified briefing I'd prepared for Pacific Fleet Command somehow found its way into a Raytheon proposal for a Navy contract worth $800 million. Not my exact words, but my strategic framework, my tactical insights, my recommendations repackaged with corporate branding, and presented as proprietary Raytheon innovation. When I confronted Jessica about the apparent coincidence, her response was smooth as polished steel. "David, you know how these things work. Great minds think alike. The defense industry is small, and innovative ideas emerge from multiple sources simultaneously. I'm sure any similarities are purely coincidental. But coincidences, I'd learned in 15 years of military service, rarely occurred in patterns. And patterns were beginning to emerge. The second irregularity surfaced during a routine security review of my consulting activities. An anonymous tip had been filed with Naval Intelligence, suggesting that I might be sharing classified information with private contractors. The investigation was thorough, professional, and ultimately concluded that no violations had occurred, but the process was humiliating. Colleagues who had respected my discretion suddenly questioned my judgment. Superiors who had trusted me with sensitive operations began requiring additional oversight of my activities. The investigation cleared my name but stained my reputation. In military culture, perception often matters more than reality, and the perception was that Admiral Chen might not be as reliable as previously assumed. My next promotion timeline was quietly extended. My assignment to a prestigious NATO command position was withdrawn without explanation. Projects I'd been leading were reassigned to other officers whose backgrounds hadn't been clouded by security reviews. Meanwhile, Jessica Liu's career was flourishing. Raytheon announced her promotion to Executive Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, citing her success in developing innovative defense solutions through collaboration with military experts. Industry publications profiled her as a rising star who understood how to bridge the gap between private sector innovation and government requirements. Her LinkedIn updates, which I found myself checking with increasing frequency, showcased conferences, awards, and professional recognition that seemed to parallel the decline in my own career trajectory. The pattern became undeniable when I discovered that Jessica wasn't working alone. A deeper investigation into Raytheon's recent contract successes revealed a disturbing network of connections. Brett Davidson, the former party host who had coasted through high school on his family's wealth, was now a program manager at the Pentagon's Defense Acquisition University. Chad Morrison, my old student council rival, had become a defense lobbyist whose firm represented multiple contractors competing for Navy contracts. 3 former classmates who had never given me a second thought in high school were now positioned at strategic points in the defense contracting ecosystem, and my consulting relationship with Jessica had provided them with access to insights they were using to outmaneuver the very military systems I'd dedicated my career to strengthening. The final confirmation came through a source I hadn't expected. My old Annapolis roommate Marcus Rodriguez, now working as a defense analyst at the Government Accountability Office. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Over drinks at our annual reunion dinner, he mentioned a pattern he'd noticed in recent contract awards. "David, you know I've been tracking defense spending inefficiencies, and something weird is happening with naval systems contracts. Companies are submitting proposals that seem to anticipate Navy requirements before they're publicly announced. It's like they have inside knowledge of strategic priorities that haven't been shared with the broader contractor community." He pulled up data on his tablet showing contract awards over the past 18 months. Raytheon had won an unusually high percentage of competitive bids, often with proposals that addressed specific pain points Marcus knew I had identified in my classified briefings. The correlation wasn't proof, but it was damning circumstantial evidence that my former classmates had weaponized our high school dynamic in ways I never could have imagined. That night, I sat in my quarters reviewing 20 years of military service, and wondering how I'd allowed myself to be manipulated by people whose primary qualification was remembering how easy it had been to overlook me the first time around. The quiet kid who had calculated trajectories while others planned parties had grown into an admiral who could coordinate international naval operations, but had somehow missed the tactical signs that former classmates were using his own expertise against him. The next morning, I made 2 decisions that would define the final act of this 2-decade drama. First, I would terminate all consulting relationships and conduct a complete review of any information I might have inadvertently shared with private contractors. Second, I would accept the invitation that had been sitting in my inbox for 3 weeks, The one I'd been planning to ignore because it seemed like a waste of time better spent on more important matters. The Lincoln High School class of 2003 20-year reunion invitation had been forwarded to my military email through some circuitous network of alumni connections. The planning committee had somehow tracked down my contact information and wanted to ensure their distinguished graduate received proper recognition at the celebration. The irony was almost too perfect to resist. What they didn't know was that their distinguished graduate had just discovered how some of his former classmates had been distinguishing themselves at his expense. The reunion would provide an opportunity for a different kind of recognition, one that would remind everyone exactly who had been underestimated 20 years ago and who had been doing the underestimating. The reunion committee had outdone themselves. Riverside Country Club gleamed under string lights that transformed the October evening into something magical. The kind of atmosphere that made middle-aged suburbanites feel young again. Class of 2003 banners hung from every available surface, and a professional photographer captured moments that would be posted to Facebook albums titled, "We Haven't Changed a Bit." I watched from 2 miles away through binoculars as my former classmates arrived in their luxury sedans and rented sports cars, stepping out in designer clothes that announced their success to anyone paying attention. The valet parking area became a runway for displaying 20 years of accumulated wealth and status: BMW, Mercedes, Tesla, Porsche. Each vehicle a statement about how far they'd traveled from teenage insecurities. Jessica Liu emerged from a silver Maserati wearing a cocktail dress that probably cost more than my first car. She paused at the entrance to check her reflection in the glass doors, the same gesture of self-conscious vanity I remembered from homecoming dances she'd attended with dates who treated her like an accessory. Now she was the accessory herself, polished and positioned for maximum impact. Brett Davidson pulled up in a black Range Rover, his wife stepping out first in stilettos that clicked against the asphalt like a countdown timer. He'd maintained his high school physique through what was obviously expensive personal training, but 20 years of desk work had softened the edges of his confidence. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that real power required more subtlety than throwing legendary parties at Daddy's mansion. Chad Morrison arrived fashionably late in a white Tesla, because of course he did. His entrance was choreographed for maximum visibility, timed to ensure the largest possible audience for his arrival. Some people never outgrow their need to be the center of attention, they just find more sophisticated ways to demand it. Through the country club's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the reunion unfolding exactly as expected. The same social clusters from 20 years ago had reformed with surgical precision. Popular kids holding court at the bar. Athletes comparing war stories about their glory days. Academic achievers discussing career trajectories with competitive undertones disguised as friendly catch-up. The DJ played carefully curated hits from our high school years, each song designed to trigger nostalgia and loosen tongues. I watched classmates laugh too loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny, compliment each other on success that wasn't particularly impressive, and perform the elaborate dance of middle-aged people pretending they'd all been friends, when most of them had barely tolerated each other as teenagers. What they didn't know was that I'd been tracking their conversations for weeks through social media surveillance that would have impressed my intelligence colleagues. The reunion planning committee had been remarkably transparent about their guest list, seating arrangements, and event schedule. Facebook posts and Instagram stories had provided a detailed map of who would be attending, what they'd been doing for 20 years, and most importantly, how they planned to present themselves to former classmates. The helicopter arrived at exactly 9:30, just as dinner service was concluding and the dancing was scheduled to begin. I'd timed the approach to coincide with the maximum number of people being outside on the terrace, where the cigar bar and dessert station had drawn most of the reunion attendees into the cool evening air. The Sikorsky UH-60 Blackhawk descended from the darkness like something from a movie, its rotors whipping the perfectly manicured landscape into chaos. Cocktail napkins became missiles. Centerpiece flowers transformed into projectiles. Hair that had been professionally styled for the evening was instantly destroyed by downdraft that turned the country club's pristine terrace into a wind tunnel. 200 former classmates pressed themselves against windows and shielded their eyes as landing lights illuminated the golf course adjacent to the club. The helicopter settled onto the 18th green with military precision, its engines winding down to create a silence that felt heavier than the noise that had preceded it. My aide, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Park, stepped out first in full dress blues, her bearing radiating the kind of competence that made civilians instinctively straighten their postures. She surveyed the stunned crowd with the professional assessment of someone trained to secure landing zones in hostile territory, then turned back to the aircraft and extended her hand to assist me as I emerged. 4 stars on my collar caught the light from the country club's illumination, each one representing years of service and levels of responsibility that none of these people could comprehend. The Navy Cross on my chest told stories of actions classified at levels above their security clearance. My uniform was immaculate, every detail perfect, from the razor-sharp creases to the mirror finish on my shoes. I walked across the golf course toward the terrace with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command, my aide following 2 steps behind in formation that announced military precision to anyone familiar with protocol. The crowd parted as we approached, conversations dying mid-sentence as former classmates tried to process what they were witnessing. The silence stretched until someone whispered my name, then another, then a ripple of recognition spread through the gathering like electricity through water. David Chen. The quiet kid from AP Physics. The one who sat alone at lunch. The one nobody remembered voting for class president. I stopped at the edge of the terrace and let my gaze sweep across faces that had looked through me for 4 years of shared hallways. Some I recognized immediately despite 20 years of changes. Others had been so irrelevant to my high school experience that they remain strangers even now. But 3 faces stood out with crystal clarity: Jessica Liu, Brett Davidson, and Chad Morrison. Jessica recovered first, stepping forward with the professional poise that had served her well in corporate boardrooms. "David Chen," she said, her voice carrying across the silent terrace, "we had no idea you were coming." What an incredible surprise. I studied her for a long moment, noting the slight tremor in her voice that betrayed nerves beneath the polished exterior. "Jessica," I replied, my tone neutral as surgical steel. "I received the invitation, though I suspect it wasn't intended for me personally." Chad Morrison found his voice next, slipping into the smooth charm that had won him student elections 2 decades earlier. "Admiral Chen, this is amazing. We're so proud to have someone of your stature represent our class." The irony was delicious. The same people who had made me invisible were now claiming ownership of my achievements. As if my success reflected well on their high school community. As if they had contributed something meaningful to the trajectory that had led me from obscurity to command authority. Brett Davidson approached with the calculated confidence of someone accustomed to working rooms full of important people. "David, I have to say, this entrance is legendary. You've certainly made an impression." I nodded slowly, acknowledging his comment without warmth. Impressions matter, don't they, Brett? Sometimes people don't make the right one the first time around. The crowd began to press closer, sensing drama unfolding, but not yet understanding its nature. Cell phones appeared, as classmates began recording what they assumed would be a heartwarming reunion story about the quiet kid who had made it big and returned to surprise his former classmates. What they were about to witness was something entirely different. I reached into my uniform jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, opening it to reveal documents that I'd spent weeks preparing with the same attention to detail I brought to military operations. The evidence was comprehensive, documented, and devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying the authority that came from years of addressing rooms full of people whose lives depended on following my orders. "I want to thank you for this reunion because it's provided an opportunity to address some unfinished business from our shared past." I turned to face Jessica Liu directly, noting how her professional composure began to crack around the edges. "Jessica, I want to thank you for reaching out to me about consulting opportunities with Raytheon. It was educational to learn how corporate intelligence gathering actually works." Her face paled as she began to understand where this was heading. "You see," I continued, addressing the larger crowd while keeping my gaze fixed on Jessica, "some of our classmates have been very interested in my military career. Specifically, they've been interested in leveraging information I've shared in professional contexts for their own advancement." I held up the first document, a detailed analysis of contract awards that showed the suspicious correlation between my classified briefings and Raytheon's subsequent proposal successes. This represents 18 months of defense contracts worth over $2 billion, awarded based on strategic insights that were obtained through what I believed were legitimate consulting relationships. The terrace had become completely silent except for the distant sound of the helicopter's cooling engines and the whisper of evening wind through the country club's landscaping. "Brett," I said, turning to face my former classmate who now looked like he wanted to disappear into the manicured shrubbery. "Your work at the Defense Acquisition University provided access to procurement timelines that made Jessica's intelligence-gathering efforts particularly valuable. I have documentation showing coordination between your office and Raytheon's proposal development team on 7 separate occasions." Brett's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. "And Chad," I concluded, facing the former student council president who had built a career on influence and connections. "Your lobbying firm's success rate with Navy contracts improved dramatically after Jessica began our consulting relationship. Coincidence? I think not." I closed the portfolio and surveyed the stunned faces surrounding me. "What you're looking at is a conspiracy to exploit military intelligence for private profit, orchestrated by people who remember how easy it was to overlook me 20 years ago and assumed it would be just as easy now." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the country club's background music seemed to have stopped playing. "The quiet kid you ignored has spent 20 years learning how to gather intelligence, analyze patterns, and expose threats to national security," I said, my voice carrying across the terrace like Judgment Day. "Congratulations. You've just discovered what happens when you underestimate someone who actually learned how to fight back." Lieutenant Commander Park stepped forward with a briefcase containing copies of evidence packets I'd prepared for each member of the conspiracy. "These documents have been forwarded to appropriate authorities, including the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service." I looked around at faces that had once defined my world, now seeing them clearly for what they truly were. Small people who had mistaken their teenage social dynamics for permanent power structures. "The reunion is over," I announced. "Admiral Chen is departing." We walked back across the golf course toward the waiting helicopter, leaving behind 200 former classmates and 3 future defendants in what would become known as the Phoenix Defense Contracting Scandal. The rotors spun up as we approached, and within minutes we were lifting off into the October night, the country club's lights shrinking below us like stars viewed from space. Through my headset, I could hear radio chatter from my aide confirming our departure time and estimated arrival at the base. But what I really heard was the sound of justice finally catching up with people who had spent 20 years assuming the quiet kid would stay quiet forever. Some reunions end with dancing and promises to stay in touch. This one ended with federal investigations and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you never have to see these people again. Part 4. The federal indictments came down 6 weeks later, each one a masterpiece of legal precision that dismantled the conspiracy piece by methodical piece. Jessica Liu was arrested at her Scottsdale home on a Tuesday morning, led away in handcuffs while her neighbors watched from behind curtains and recorded everything on their phones. The footage made local news, then national news, then became a case study in corporate espionage that business schools would analyze for decades. Brett Davidson's arrest occurred during a Pentagon meeting he was conducting on procurement procedures. Federal agents waited until he finished his presentation on ethics in government contracting before serving the warrant. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. His security clearance was revoked immediately, his career in defense acquisition terminated before lunch. Chad Morrison proved the most dramatic of the 3. When FBI agents arrived at his lobbying firm's K Street offices, he was in the middle of a conference call with potential clients, selling his ability to navigate the complexities of defense contracting. The call was still active when they placed him under arrest, his promises of insider access transforming into evidence of criminal intent broadcast to a room full of witnesses. The media coverage exceeded my expectations. The Phoenix Defense Contracting Scandal, as journalists dubbed it, had everything they loved: corruption, conspiracy, military secrets, and a protagonist whose quiet competence had been weaponized against his former tormentors. Network news programs featured the story prominently. Defense industry publications ran lengthy analyses of the security vulnerabilities the case had exposed. Cable news talking heads debated the broader implications for military-industrial oversight. But the coverage that meant the most came from an unexpected source. My high school newspaper, the Lincoln Lion's Roar, now published online by current students who had discovered that their school's most famous graduate had just exposed a major federal conspiracy. Their article, written by 17-year-old journalists who understood the social dynamics better than adult reporters, captured something the mainstream media had missed. The headline read, "Admiral Chen proves revenge is a dish best served with federal indictments." The student journalist who wrote the piece had interviewed current Lincoln High faculty members, several of whom remembered me from 20 years earlier. Their quotes painted a picture of institutional blindness that extended far beyond my specific experience. Mrs. Rodriguez, now the head of the math department, admitted that the school had consistently undervalued students who didn't fit traditional leadership models. David was brilliant, dedicated, and principled, but we measured success by popularity rather than potential. We failed him, and frankly, we probably failed others like him. The article quoted current students who identified with my high school experience, kids who were academically gifted but socially invisible, working harder than their popular classmates but receiving less recognition. The reporter had somehow tracked down my old yearbook photos and contrasted them with official Navy portraits that showed my transformation from overlooked teenager to decorated admiral. What struck me most was the article's conclusion. Admiral Chen didn't just get revenge on the classmates who wronged him. He proved that the qualities that made him invisible in high school, analytical thinking, strategic planning, quiet determination, were exactly the qualities that made him invaluable to his country. Maybe it's time our school reconsidered how we define success. The professional consequences for my former classmates unfolded with bureaucratic inevitability. Jessica Liu's plea agreement included a 10-year federal prison sentence and permanent disbarment from defense contracting. Raytheon terminated her employment and launched an internal investigation that uncovered additional irregularities, resulting in corporate fines that exceeded $50 million. Brett Davidson received 8 years and forfeited his government pension, his decades of public service negated by his willingness to compromise national security for personal advancement. The Defense Acquisition University implemented new oversight protocols specifically designed to prevent the kind of information sharing that had enabled the conspiracy. Chad Morrison's lobbying firm collapsed within weeks of his indictment, clients fleeing to avoid association with the scandal. His 7-year sentence included provisions requiring him to testify about other potentially compromised defense contracts, effectively ending any possibility of future work in Washington's influence industry. The legal proceedings provided a fascinating window into their motivations. During the sentencing hearings, all 3 defendants expressed remorse. But their allocutions revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had led to their downfall. They had genuinely believed that I was still the quiet, overlooked kid from high school who could be manipulated without consequence. Jessica's statement was particularly illuminating. I thought David would be grateful for the opportunity to contribute to private sector innovation. I never considered that he might view our collaboration as exploitation rather than partnership. Even facing federal prison, she couldn't comprehend that her high school classmate had evolved beyond her teenage assessment of his character. The scandal's resolution coincided with my promotion to vice admiral, an advancement that had been delayed by the security investigation but was now accelerated in recognition of my role in exposing the conspiracy. The promotion ceremony took place at the Pentagon, attended by colleagues who had watched me navigate the crisis with the same steady competence I brought to military operations. During the reception afterward, Admiral Patricia Williams, my commanding officer and mentor, pulled me aside for a private conversation. David, I've watched officers handle career-threatening situations in various ways. Most become bitter, defensive, or paranoid. You turned your crisis into a masterclass in strategic thinking and patient execution. That's why you're going to succeed at levels most officers never reach. Her words proved prophetic. Within 18 months, I was nominated for promotion to full admiral and assignment as commander of Pacific Fleet Operations, one of the most prestigious positions in the Navy. The nomination hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee provided an opportunity to discuss the scandal's broader implications for military security. Senator Patricia Martinez of Arizona, who chaired the committee, asked directly about lessons learned from the experience. Admiral Chen, how do we prevent future exploitation of military personnel by private contractors seeking to gain unfair advantages in the procurement process? My response drew from 20 years of military service and 6 months of intensive investigation into my own exploitation. Senator, the vulnerability exists at the intersection of professional relationships and personal history. In my case, former classmates leveraged shared background to establish trust that bypassed normal security protocols. We need systems that evaluate relationships based on professional merit rather than social connections. The hearing room was packed with defense industry representatives, military officers, and congressional staff members who understood the implications of my testimony. I wasn't just describing my personal experience. I was outlining systemic vulnerabilities that threatened national security whenever personal relationships were weaponized for professional advantage. My confirmation was unanimous, a rare achievement in contemporary Washington that reflected bipartisan recognition of my competence and integrity. The ceremony took place on the USS Gerald Ford, the Navy's newest aircraft carrier, with my parents in attendance for the first time since my Naval Academy graduation. Watching my father, now in his 70s, witness his son being promoted to 4-star admiral provided perspective on the entire journey, from invisible teenager to naval command. During our private moment after the ceremony, he spoke in the mixture of English and Mandarin that characterized our most emotional conversations. David, in China we have saying, "The bamboo that bends in the storm survives while the rigid oak breaks." You learned to bend without breaking, to stay strong while appearing flexible. Your high school classmates thought flexibility was weakness. They were wrong. The Phoenix chapter of my life officially closed 3 months later when Lincoln High School invited me to deliver the commencement address for the class of 2024. Standing on the same stage where I had received my diploma 21 years earlier, addressing an audience that included faculty members who remembered my teenage invisibility, felt like completing a circle that had taken 2 decades to draw. My speech focused on the difference between recognition and achievement, between being seen and being valuable. I told the graduating seniors that popularity was temporary, but competence was permanent, that the qualities that made them different might be exactly what the world needed most. After the ceremony, current students approached me with questions that revealed how much had changed at Lincoln High. The school now had active programs for academically gifted students, mentorship opportunities that connected quiet achievers with adult advocates, and recognition systems that valued intellectual contribution alongside social leadership. One student, a quiet junior named Michael Park, who reminded me intensely of my teenage self, asked the question that had haunted my own high school experience. Admiral Chen, how do you keep working hard when nobody notices what you're doing? I looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of determination and discouragement that had defined my own adolescence. Michael, the work you do when nobody's watching determines what you're capable of when everybody is. Keep building your capabilities, even if the applause comes later. As I flew back to San Diego that evening, the Arizona desert stretching endlessly below my aircraft, I reflected on the strange mathematics of justice and time. 21 years earlier, I had left Phoenix feeling invisible and undervalued. I was returning as a 4-star admiral, whose actions had exposed federal crimes and reformed military security protocols. The quiet kid who had been excluded from the reunion had ultimately provided the most memorable reunion moment in Lincoln High School history. But more importantly, I had proven to myself that invisibility was not permanent, that patient competence could overcome social hierarchy, and that the best revenge was not just success, but using that success to prevent others from experiencing the same dismissal. My phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Commander Park, now serving as my aide in Pacific Fleet operations. The message was brief but significant. Admiral, the Phoenix investigation has led to 3 additional cases involving similar contractor exploitation schemes. Your work is having impact beyond the original conspiracy. I smiled, recognizing that the high school reunion had become something larger than personal vindication. It had exposed systemic vulnerabilities that threatened military effectiveness and demonstrated the importance of protecting dedicated service members from exploitation by those who mistook their dedication for naivete. The helicopter that had descended onto the 18th green of Riverside Country Club had carried more than just Admiral Chen. It had carried the accumulated weight of 2 decades spent transforming invisibility into invincibility, overlooked potential into undeniable achievement. Some stories end with reconciliation and forgiveness. This one ended with justice served, capabilities proven, and a clear understanding that the best response to being underestimated is not anger, but excellence that speaks louder than any words ever could. Part 5. 5 years later, I stood on the bridge of the USS Phoenix, the Navy's most advanced guided missile destroyer, watching sunrise paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and crimson. As commander of Pacific Fleet Operations, I oversaw strategic operations across an area covering more than half the world's surface, coordinating with allied navies from Japan to Australia in missions that kept international shipping lanes secure and global commerce flowing. The irony of commanding a ship named Phoenix was not lost on me. Like the mythical bird, I had risen from the ashes of my high school experience, transformed by fire into something stronger and more purposeful than I could have imagined during those lonely lunch periods at Lincoln High. My morning briefing included intelligence reports that would influence decisions affecting thousands of service members and millions of civilians whose security depended on naval operations they would never see or fully understand. The weight of command had taught me that true leadership was measured not by how many people noticed your contributions, but by how many people were protected by your competence. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Park, now my Chief of Staff, approached with the daily communications folder. Among the routine operational updates was a letter that would redefine my understanding of the Phoenix defense contracting scandal's lasting impact. The letter came from Dr. Michael Park, the quiet junior who had asked me about working hard when nobody noticed. He was now Dr. Park, having completed his doctorate in cybersecurity at MIT, and he was writing to inform me that his research had been inspired by our conversation 5 years earlier. His dissertation, titled Institutional Blindness and National Security: How Social Hierarchies Create Intelligence Vulnerabilities, had become required reading at multiple military academies and intelligence training programs. His work demonstrated that organizations that overlooked quiet competence in favor of charismatic leadership were systematically vulnerable to the kind of exploitation I had exposed. Dr. Park's research had identified similar patterns in corporate espionage cases, diplomatic security breaches, and intelligence failures across multiple agencies. His recommendations for structural reforms were being implemented by organizations that had never heard of Lincoln High School, but were learning from its most famous graduates' experience with institutional blindness. The letter concluded with news that vindicated every lonely lunch period I had endured. Admiral Chen, you probably don't remember me, but you changed my life by showing me that being overlooked was temporary, while being competent was permanent. I wanted you to know that your example inspired research that is making our country safer by protecting other quiet achievers from the kind of exploitation you experienced. I remembered him perfectly. The earnest eyes, the careful questions, the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that had characterized my own teenage years. Knowing that our brief conversation had catalyzed research with national security implications demonstrated something I was still learning to accept. Leadership was not just about commanding ships or winning battles, but about inspiring others to develop their own capabilities. That afternoon brought news that connected my past to my present in ways I had not anticipated. Jessica Liu had been released from federal prison after serving her full sentence, and according to intelligence reports, she was attempting to rebuild her career as a consultant, specializing in defense ethics training. The audacity was breathtaking, but also predictable for someone who had never truly understood why her actions had been wrong. Her consulting company, Phoenix Strategic Ethics, represented the kind of shameless rebranding that only former criminals seemed capable of executing. Her marketing materials emphasized her, quote, unique perspective on the dangers of improper contractor relationships, and her, quote, hard-earned expertise in preventing the kind of security breaches that threaten military effectiveness. What Jessica failed to understand was that ethical behavior was not a consulting specialty to be marketed, but a fundamental character trait that either existed or did not. Her attempt to monetize her criminal experience demonstrated the same moral blindness that had led to her downfall, the same inability to distinguish between competence and manipulation that had characterized her approach to our high school relationship. Brett Davidson had taken a different path. After his release, he had become a community college instructor, teaching basic government courses to students who were often the first in their families to pursue higher education. His LinkedIn profile, which I occasionally checked out of professional curiosity, showed a man who had found purpose in genuine service, rather than self-advancement. His student evaluations, which were public record, consistently praised his insights into government operations and his emphasis on ethical decision-making. One review noted, "Professor Davidson talks about government work like someone who has seen both the best and worst of public service. He makes sure we understand that integrity is not optional in positions of trust." Perhaps prison had provided Brett with the perspective that privilege had denied him. His current work suggested genuine remorse and a commitment to preventing others from making his mistakes. While I could not forgive his betrayal, I could respect his apparent transformation. Chad Morrison had vanished from public view entirely. His social media accounts had been deleted, his professional networks abandoned, his attempts at reinvention apparently unsuccessful. Sometimes the consequences of betraying trust were permanent, reputation being a resource that could be depleted beyond recovery. The anniversary of my helicopter landing at the reunion had become an informal holiday among Naval Academy midshipmen, who referred to October 15th as Admiral Chen Day, and shared the story as inspiration for maintaining integrity under pressure. The tale had evolved through multiple retellings, acquiring details that were probably apocryphal, but certainly entertaining. According to midshipman legend, I had planned the helicopter entrance for years, coordinating with Hollywood special effects experts to maximize dramatic impact. Some versions claimed I had worn a custom uniform designed specifically for the occasion, complete with hidden cameras to record my classmates' reactions. Other embellishments suggested the helicopter had been equipped with loudspeakers that played Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries during the descent. The truth was simpler and more powerful than any embellishment. I had simply applied military planning principles to a personal situation, achieving strategic surprise through careful preparation and precise execution. The helicopter had been a calculated choice designed to demonstrate that the quiet kid from Lincoln High now commanded resources and respect that transcended any high school social hierarchy. My aide interrupted my reflection with news that would add another chapter to the Phoenix story. The Lincoln High School Alumni Association had voted to establish the Admiral David Chen Leadership Award, recognizing graduates who demonstrated exceptional integrity and service, despite facing significant obstacles during their school years. The award criteria specifically mentioned students who had been, quote, overlooked, underestimated, or excluded by their peers, but who later achieved distinction through perseverance, competence, and ethical leadership. The first recipient would be announced at the upcoming 25-year reunion of the class of 2003. The invitation to present the inaugural award arrived with a personal note from the current principal, Dr. Martinez, who had been a student teacher during my senior year. She wrote, "Admiral Chen, your example has fundamentally changed how our school identifies and nurtures leadership potential. We would be honored if you would help us celebrate the kind of student you once were and inspire the kind of leaders you have become." I accepted the invitation, recognizing an opportunity to complete the circle that had begun with my exclusion from reunion planning and culminated with my helicopter entrance 5 years earlier. This time, however, my purpose was not vindication but inspiration, not proving my worth but helping others discover theirs. The weeks leading to the reunion provided time to reflect on the broader implications of my journey, from invisible teenager to Pacific Fleet commander. Military service had taught me that individual competence was meaningless without institutional support, that personal achievement required collective effort, and that true leadership was measured by the success of those who served under your command. My flag staff now included officers who had been inspired by the Phoenix story to pursue military careers, young leaders who understood that being overlooked was not a verdict, but an opportunity to develop capabilities without distraction. Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Walsh, my intelligence officer, had been a socially awkward physics major at the Naval Academy, who found confidence through my example of quiet competence. Commander Marcus Thompson, my operations officer, had grown up in inner-city Detroit, academically gifted but socially isolated, who used his invisibility to develop the analytical skills that made him invaluable in strategic planning. His promotion to captain had been accelerated based on innovations in tactical coordination that drew directly from his experience of observing social dynamics from the outside. These officers represented a new generation of military leaders who understood that diversity of background and perspective was not just morally correct, but strategically essential. They had learned from my experience that institutional blindness was not just unfair to overlooked individuals, but dangerous to organizations that failed to identify and develop their most capable members. The 25-year reunion took place at the same Riverside Country Club, though the venue had been renovated and expanded since my helicopter landing. The evening began with cocktails on the terrace where I had confronted my former classmates, the same space that now hosted a gathering focused on celebration rather than vindication. This time I arrived conventionally, driving my own car and walking through the front entrance like any other alumnus. The difference was not in my mode of transportation, but in the reception I received. Former classmates who had ignored me for 4 years of high school now approached with genuine respect, seeking not favors or connections, but simply the opportunity to acknowledge someone whose achievements had brought honor to their shared alma mater. The conversations were different too. Instead of the superficial networking that had characterized previous reunions, classmates asked substantive questions about military service, international relations, and leadership challenges. They listened to my responses with the attention they had never shown during our teenage years, perhaps finally mature enough to value competence over charisma. When the time came to present the Admiral David Chen Leadership Award, I walked to the podium not as the excluded outsider seeking recognition, but as a successful leader, returning to inspire the next generation. The recipient was Maria Santos, a 2018 graduate who had been relentlessly bullied for her academic focus and social awkwardness, but had gone on to develop revolutionary water purification technology that was saving lives in developing countries. Maria's story echoed my own in fundamental ways: the isolation, the dedication, the transformation of perceived weakness into undeniable strength. As I handed her the award, I saw in her eyes the same mixture of determination and vindication that had sustained me through my own journey from invisibility to command. My presentation speech focused on the paradox of leadership in institutions that often confused visibility with value. True leaders, I told the audience, are forged not in the spotlight of popularity but in the crucible of perseverance. They develop their capabilities when nobody is watching, so they are ready when everybody needs them. The evening concluded with conversations that would have been impossible 25 years earlier. Former classmates asked thoughtful questions about career development, shared stories of their own struggles with being overlooked or underestimated, and expressed genuine appreciation for the example I had set through military service. Jessica Liu was not in attendance, having been excluded from reunion planning due to her criminal record. Brett Davidson had sent regrets, explaining that he was teaching evening classes at the community college. Chad Morrison remained absent from all alumni activities, his name conspicuously missing from the memorial wall that honored deceased classmates and the recognition board that celebrated distinguished graduates. The drive home through Phoenix streets I had once navigated as an invisible teenager provided time to consider the complete arc of my journey. 25 years had transformed not just my own circumstances, but the institution that had initially failed to recognize my potential. Lincoln High School now actively identified and supported students like my teenage self, ensuring that quiet competence was nurtured rather than neglected. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Michael Park, now serving as a cybersecurity advisor to the Department of Defense. He was writing to inform me that his research had been expanded into a comprehensive program for identifying and protecting overlooked talent in government agencies, corporate environments, and academic institutions. The Phoenix defense contracting scandal had become more than a personal vindication. It had catalyzed systemic reforms that protected countless individuals from exploitation while strengthening national security through better recognition and development of quiet competence. As I reached my hotel, I reflected on the difference between revenge and justice, between personal satisfaction and institutional improvement. My helicopter landing 5 years earlier had been necessary for my own psychological healing. But the lasting value lay in the changes it had inspired, in how institutions identified and developed leadership potential. The quiet kid who had been excluded from high school reunion planning had not just crashed the party, he had transformed the entire conversation about recognition, achievement, and the dangerous assumption that visibility equals value. Tomorrow, I would return to my command, overseeing operations that protected international shipping lanes and maintained strategic stability across the Pacific. The responsibilities were immense, the decisions consequential, the margin for error minimal. But I would execute those duties with the same quiet competence that had carried me from invisible teenager to fleet commander, secure in the knowledge that true leadership was measured not by who noticed your contributions, but by whose lives were improved by your service. The reunion was over, but the story continued. Somewhere in Phoenix, a quiet teenager was sitting alone at lunch, developing capabilities that nobody yet recognized, preparing for contributions that would only be appreciated decades later. The cycle continued, but now the institutions were better prepared to identify and nurture that potential. That was the real victory, not just personal vindication, but systemic improvement that would prevent others from experiencing the institutional blindness that had nearly wasted my own talents. The helicopter landing had been spectacular, but the lasting impact was in the quiet transformations that followed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.